Welcome everyone to this SSE Alumni Webinar on the topic of how retail consumer behavior shift during crises such as COVID-19. My name is Anna Månsson and I work at the Alumni Office at the Stockholm School of Economics, together with my coworkers Elin and Nutchen, who are also here this evening. I would like to start up with some housekeeping rules. So due to the number of participants, we have muted you, but feel free to submit any questions you have in the chat to me, Anna Månsson. There will be time for a brief Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to participate by adding your questions and thoughts in the chat all the way during the webinar. Also, please turn on your video. It's nice to be able to see one another. And finally, we will be recording this webinar, so it will be available afterwards. But now it's time for this evening's highlight. During this webinar, Jonas Colliander, Assistant Professor at the Center for Retailing at SSE, will showcase and discuss his research on consumer behavior and how it shifts during crises, as well as the opportunities that can arise from this and how companies can harness them. Jonas is part of SSE's research project, Sweden Through the Crisis, which is a comprehensive report from more than 80 researchers exploring how and why Sweden's approach to COVID-19 is different and how to navigate the challenges caused by the pandemic. Since joining the Center for Retailing, Jonas is also continuously investigating the link between social media and e-commerce. Welcome, Jonas.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Good. Very nice to be here, and nice to see that so many of you signed up for this presentation. This is going to be, like was said, this is going to be a presentation on consumer behavior during crisis and afterwards. And this presentation is the result of a report that I've written together with Professor Sara Rosengren, who's also with the Center for Retailing, and this is a summary of relevant research that's been done on crises and consumers' reactions to crisis throughout the world. So I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. As I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat, and we'll discuss it in the Q&A afterwards. So let's see here if I can get this presentation working. So can you see it? Nods, good. Okay, so consumer behavior during and after COVID-19. First of all, I want to make a few notes about the research that we've been using for this report. And this, usually when you talk about economic downturns as an economist and as someone from the Stockholm School of Economics, we look at, like last time we looked at bank crises and stuff like that. This crisis and this type of crisis that we're seeing currently is a very different kind of crisis. It's a health crisis that has economic and financial implications. And as a result of that, tracking consumer behaviors and making predictions on consumer behavior during this type of crisis is somewhat different. So in order to sort of accurately assess how consumers would possibly behave during this type of event, something that German Chancellor Angela Merkel here has said is the greatest challenge we've seen since the Second World War. Me and Sarah, we went through a wide range of literature in order to assess this kind of behavior. So we not only looked at economic crisis and what results that might have on consumer behaviors. We also looked at events like the 2003 SARS outbreak in Asia, for example. We've looked at research seeing how consumers react after events such as hurricanes, wildfires. There's quite a few stories and a few research papers written on how consumers behave post events like terror attacks like 9/11 and so on. So we've tried to merge all of that in order to understand somewhat, or to get a bit of a picture on how consumers reacted during events like this. And since this is research on such broad topics, what I'm going to present today is rather sort of broad strokes. It is we're focusing on sort of the broader behaviors, the psychological impact of events like this, and the possible effect it can have. So I know there were some questions posed beforehand on the impact on specific industries and so on. I'm not going to go so much into that, but I'd rather ask you to try to, and that's the thing when listening to academic research. It's I'm going to ask you to try to take what I'm saying and seeing, okay, even though this is done at a specific time and place in a specific context, it still has wider implications that can be applied to specific industries. Or the trick here is to listen to what I say and try to see, okay, how could this possibly be relevant for my industry, or for my specific topic of interest here. So bear with me, is what I'm trying to say. And I'm going to then talk a little bit about like consumer behavior during the actual crisis, like during an epidemic and during a hurricane or whatever it might be. And I'm also going to talk about consumer behaviors post-crises afterwards. But the first part of this presentation, and total length of the presentation, is going to be about 20 to 25 minutes, by the way. So that's what you can expect. Longer than that, it usually is kind of tedious on Zoom in a webinar like this. So I would rather we spend some time on discussion rather than me talking into a screen. But when you look at the research literature on consumer behavior during crisis, you have pretty much 6 broad themes that come up that the sort of researchers have looked at, or they've found during events like this. So basically, you have first of all, you have the psychological impact. You have increased feelings of insecurity, anxiety, loss of control, things like that. And that then has an effect on how consumers behave. So what we see is reduced spending overall. We have typically increased spending on essentials. Bulk buying is a typical response. You have increased e-commerce. And interestingly, we have some segments in society where we see more, like contrary to a lot of other people, we see more impulsive buying and compulsive buying. And I will talk about each of these in turn for a little bit now. So when you have these emotional effects that we talked about, when you look at these events, Hurricane Katrina, and as we see here, the SARS epidemic in Hong Kong, you see general levels of worry, helplessness, anxiety in the population. And you typically see that especially among those who are directly affected naturally, health, employment, income affected, and so on. There you see general high levels of these negative emotions going up. And that is pretty consistent in this literature, both for sort of natural disasters and pandemics or epidemics, and also when you look at sort of the effect of economic crises. So that's sort of the general feeling that increases, and that then has a number on effect on behaviors, like I said. We have consumers spend less. Hong Kong, for example, when you look at that research, during the SARS epidemic in 2003, saw a decrease in GDP of about 4.2% during that crisis. So it was a steep fall in purchases and the resulting long-lasting economic damage that crisis resulted in. And you see that also during COVID-19 now. This number here is an estimate for 2020 by Forrester Research on how much consumer spending in the retail sector will decrease during this pandemic, 9.6% in this case. that is about $2.2 trillion in decreased revenue for the retail sector. And it is estimated by a lot of, there are a few different estimates on how long this will take to get consumer spending back to where it was before the crisis. And those estimates range between, the ones I've seen, range between 3 and 5 years. Forrester, for example, which I've quoted here, they estimate that it will take about 4 years to return to pre-pandemic levels of consumer spending and consumer purchases. So quite a steep economic decrease, as we've all seen during this crisis, and the one that will likely take quite a while to recover from. So less spending, basic factor. Now, that less spending, that doesn't sort of doesn't work. It's not that consumers spend less across the board. What you see is that consumers shift spending away from sort of more luxury items, more stuff like, or more sällanköp in Swedish, items that are not considered essential. So fashion, as you see, in April, like when the corona crisis struck in Sweden, saw a sharp decrease. Beauty saw a sharp decrease. Shoes saw a sharp decrease. Fashion went down 34%, for example, in spending, whereas consumers shift spending and spend comparatively more on items that they deem essential. So grocery spending, even though people don't usually sort of eat more necessarily, people tend, for emotional security, to cope with some of the anxiety that I mentioned earlier. People tend to spend more on necessities, so that they can have a buffer, so to speak, during these times. So groceries in April in Sweden, for instance, saw an increase of 7%. So you get even though consumers spend less overall, some sectors typically see an increase during these difficult times. And then we have this bulk buying of essentials. Now, you probably all, those of you who are in Sweden anyway, you might recall that during the early days of the corona crisis, there was all this talk about people buying toilet paper off the shelves in retailers. And toilet paper could be considered an essential, I guess. But you also see this behavior when it comes to bulk buying and stockpiling of essentials across a lot of these different categories, groceries and petrol and so on and so forth. You've seen that during a lot of these crises throughout the last 30 years or so that we looked at through this research. So when we looked at this, just to do our own research on this, we tracked, actually, we're at the Center for Retailing, we have a cooperation with one of the larger retailers in Sweden. And we looked at the data, which we, after the initial announcement of crisis from this public health agency, the peak of buying, we saw about 48 hours after that was done in March. I forgot which date it was now, but it was one of the dates in March. So 48 hours after the announcement was made by the public health agency, you saw the purchases at this retailer, which then supplies one of the essentials, which I mentioned, was up by about 74%. So there is a shift, emotional. We have people feeling emotional stress, and as a result, they shift to essentials, and they tend to buy a lot more of these essentials in bulk when they purchase. So for those of you listening who are in the grocery industries, I'm sure you sort of recognize some of these numbers. And then when you look at the previous events that have happened, or in particular when you look at outbreaks of disease and epidemics and so on, then you see an increase in e-commerce. These numbers are from our grocery shopping in Hong Kong in 2003. when the SARS epidemic struck. And this is from the larger, at the time, the largest online grocery retailer in Hong Kong. And you see here, they did, a couple of researchers went back and tracked, okay, what happened with online purchases during this crisis when there was a similar situation as we see now. There's a disease out, people don't want to get in close contact with one another. And then what happens with sort of online retailing. And as you can see, they looked at 4 different common categories of these essentials. And the blue, they looked at rice, cooking oil, canned goods, and frozen food. And the blue staples here represent the purchases that was made before SARS, before the epidemic struck. And the orange staples here look at represent the purchasing levels that was during the actual pandemic. And as you can see here, quite naturally, e-commerce went up quite substantially during the crisis and got a real boost through this epidemic when people did not want to get into close proximity with one another. So instead they stayed home and purchased from home, from their computer. And bear in mind, this was 2003, so this was quite early during the levels of e-commerce. Now we'll get into the numbers in Sweden also, because what we saw in Sweden in the grocery sector was that in 1 month, the levels of e-commerce went up by over 100% in April compared to the previous months. So we saw a sharp increase in e-commerce in Sweden. And that was across, this is for groceries, like essential, like I said, but even though categories like fashion, etc., decreased their overall levels of purchase, even those sectors saw a sharp increase in e-commerce. I think fashion in April was up about 15%. It just wasn't enough to offset the general decrease from brick and mortar stores that they saw during that time. So e-commerce goes up quite substantially, typically during these events. And then we have this other interesting development, which I talked about earlier, which is that for some individuals, this feeling, this loss of psychological control, these feelings of anxiety and worry that people feel, they are sometimes, especially for segments like low income segments, people with less disposable incomes that are sort of feeling this financial stress even stronger than other more high income segments. These people researched both during Hurricane Katrina and also during other crises like wildfires and so on. There's a research stream on that in the US. You typically see an increase among some people of impulsive buying and compulsive buying. And as this quote here indicates, like, it seems that I'm filling this void, can't cope with what happens, so I numb myself through different methods like buying things that I don't really need. It's a way of restoring this psychological control and restoring this and getting some sort of remedy towards this worry and this feeling of anxiety, loss of control that people are feeling. So even though in this case, these researchers went down to New Orleans where Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005, and research people, they've lost everything. They've lost their homes, they've lost their living, they've lost pretty much everything. And even though people were sitting there having nothing essentially, they still went out and buy both like washing machines and things with their credit cards, just to restore these feelings of psychological control. And that's something that we see among a minority of people during crises like this. But for some people, we've seen when we interviewed people even during COVID-19, even though they're in stressful financial situations and might have lost their jobs, people still sometimes shop more, even though they really shouldn't, in order to sort of get this feeling of control back. So that's also something that's an offshoot, a sort of anomaly in this general trend of people spending less, people spending shopping more online and so on. But for some segments, we see this kind of behavior as well. So when we look at then behavior post-crisis, now this research that I went through earlier, this was a general level of how people behave in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of people, when people are, like I said, with Hurricane Katrina, when they are in the middle of this stressful situation. Now, long term, of course, this is interesting as well to see what happens when the immediate crisis has subsided. Also, what happens, in the long term as a result of this crisis. We're seeing an economic downturn at the moment, for example, but how long will it last, and why does it come about? Are interesting questions that a lot of researchers have looked at as well. So there are 4 general trends that people look at and discuss about this post-crisis behavior. There's an increased restraint when people buy. There's this aspect of less financial resources that people have. Interestingly, also as a research stream that's looked at this, something called a quest for simplicity. People seeking more simpler pleasures and simpler goods, cleaner design, and so on. And there's this trend that e-commerce will remain at a higher level after these crises, that these crises act as a catalyst for increased e-commerce. So looking at this from the beginning then, again, going back to this previous research on how people react long term after hurricane strike, after a pandemic or whatnot, there is the general consensus among all of these researchers is that people will hold back on purchases for a long time. So generally, after a stressful situation, it triggers more restraint because as we see here on the quote, the lower quote, these events typically remind people about the fragility of life, and as a result, people tend to go towards feelings of emotional meaning rather than material or financial meanings during these events. So people will take their time buying things. People will not worry as much typically about having the latest TV or the latest phone or wherever it might be. Usually people take a step back after these types of events and sort of look at things from an emotional point of view, and rather than a need for status hunting and seeking the latest always. And that's something that's quite consistent across these different crises that people have looked at. So holding back on purchases, taking your time buying things, being more restrained is one characteristic that we see long term after these types of events. And then, of course, you can't get around the fact that people, like as these economic downturns, these unemployment that will come as a result of crises, people will have less financial resources, and as a result, they will spend less, and it will take a long time to recover from this crisis. This figure that I put in here is just an illustration. This is the U.S. unemployment rate for this year, and as you can see, people lost their jobs in droves in the U.S. Job losses weren't as dramatic in Sweden, but we still saw quite a few people losing their jobs. And we are a small nation. We are very dependent on exports. And as demand decreases in the rest of the world, that will affect our manufacturing and our industry as well. And as a result, people will have less financial resources and they will spend less. And combined with the factor that I mentioned earlier, the fact that people will seek more emotional meaning rather than material meaning, that will contribute to the numbers I mentioned earlier. That will take several years to recover from these types of events. So less financial resources, hold back more is a large theme in this stream of research. And then there are a few other interesting findings that are maybe not as intuitive with regards to this type of crisis. Now, a couple of people have looked at, okay, what type of product, what type of brands and products do people search for following these crises? And there have been arguments made that, for example, after World War I, when there was a huge, like a devastating war, that gave rise to people. Some have argued that gave rise to things like the Bauhaus school of design, which emphasized this simple design, form follows function, which then gave rise to, or some argue gave rise to functionalism later on. After the .com bust in the late 90s, early 90s, you saw a rise in these type of publication that emphasize simple life, simple design. Some people argue that the sort of clean, simple designs of things like iPods and Apple products got an additional boost from the crisis, and that was, people appreciated that kind of design more, the simple design, the simple things in life, and that gave that an increased boost the sales of those types of products. So that is a recurring theme. Like a lot of these, after these types of events, people tend to go for simpler products, simpler designs, cleaner lines, or whatever you want to call it. And that is something that can be quite potent for some firms that are into there, for whom design are important and stuff like that. But there's also this stream that looked at, okay, what kind of brands do people tend to pick after crisis? And brands are interesting because they serve as carriers of information, more or less. There are a lot of different functions like symbols and things like that, but brands also function as carriers of information for consumers. You know what you get when you buy larger brand, more well-known brands. And in these times of crisis, or immediately following these times of crisis, when people have, like I mentioned earlier, they have a lot on their minds, they have anxiety, people are more stressed, there's a lot more anxiety coming up. And then people want to spend less cognitive resources, spend less effort into choosing what kind of brands that they have. And as a result of that, people tend to go for larger brands, more well-known brands, because, well, you know what you get, basically. So as a result, after these types of crises, a lot of brand researchers see that larger, more well-known brands tend to get a boost from this type of event. And an additional factor is then, of course, that after these crises, a lot of the smaller brands tend to have trouble. We have seen a lot of bankruptcies in Sweden, for example, for smaller brands, and as a result, the larger brands, in addition to the people being more prone to go for the larger brands, they also gain market share from competition going out of business. So those are quite maybe not as intuitive, but also quite interesting finding for someone who's in marketing like myself. And then you see this continuous trend of online retailing. These are the same numbers that or sort of from the same study that I showed you before, how e-commerce was affected in Hong Kong during the SARS epidemic there. And as you might recall, the blue bars are the levels of online purchases of these 4 categories in groceries before the pandemic, and the orange bars were the levels of online purchases actually during the crisis. Now in this picture, however, I've added one staple, and that's the gray one. and which shows then the levels of online retailing or online purchase of these categories after the crisis subsided. And what these researchers concluded then was for most of the categories that they investigated here, online stayed at a much higher level than what they had seen before the pandemic. So even though this the online retailing saw an increase during the epidemic because people didn't want to be in close proximity from one another, that sort of set habits for a lot of people. So the levels of, as you can see in the gray staples here, the levels of online purchases stayed quite high even after the crisis has subsided. So what they saw there was that this type of event formed, as I mentioned earlier, like a catalyst. It accelerated a development that was on the way anyway, but given this crisis, it really got a boost during these times. And as you can see, for 3 out of these 4 categories that were investigated, the levels were much higher after the crisis have subsided than it was before. The exception was for frozen food, and they explained that with that in Hong Kong, apparently people had small freezers, so it was difficult to maintain this kind of high purchases in frozen food. But in general, you see this high level of online sticking even after the crisis subside. And just to bring a few examples of how these are still very, very preliminary numbers. We're still in the middle of this crisis. But what we can see here is even beyond the initial April boost of e-commerce, this behavior seems to be we appear to be sticking to this. Still too early to tell. We're still in the middle of this, but I wouldn't be surprised if these levels stayed for a longer time than after even this Corona crisis has subsided. But just to give you some figures of how it's sort of maintained at the moment anyway. Now in July, it was 45% higher, the Swedish e-commerce, as compared to July in the previous years. When it comes to online groceries, which I mentioned earlier, and like in the previous example from Hong Kong, 70% of people had purchased groceries online during July of 2000, as compared to 12%, so a quite substantial increase in July 2019. And 30% of the respondents in this study, which is the E-barometern by PostNord, I believe, 30% estimated in that study that they purchased more online since the beginning than they did before the COVID-19 crisis struck. So increases, and it will be interesting to see from a research perspective if this online levels, what it will be after the crisis has subsided, and we hopefully get a vaccine. But when we're doing some interview studies, talking to some of these online retailers at the Center for Retailing, and we've seen that this is a quite striking quote that one of the CEOs mentioned when we talked to him, that essentially what they saw was they saw 5 years of estimated 5 years of development, 5 years worth of growth in about 2 months. So it was quite a challenging time for them when they had to, get a lot of extra people on board. They had a lot of problems with deliveries and so on. But in terms of purchase behavior from consumers, they saw a 5-year development, a 5-year increase in about 2 months. Then I also wanted to, right at the end of this seminar, I wanted to talk a little bit about 2 things. The first one I want to talk about is some interesting, not about from the sort of world of crisis research, but it was something that I want to emphasize, and that some have seen as an opportunity here, is that there is quite a lot of research into what happens when people suddenly enter new situations, when their life situations and their circumstances are radically changed, as in when people switch jobs, people have moved to a new city, people have children, and so on, when there are quite substantial changes in their situation. Now, what happens then basically is that consumers tend to develop a lot of new habits and try a lot of new different products. And this study here, and sort of the study here that I showed you here, is that an experiment where they looked at these kind of people who've just changed, had major changes in their life situation, and they tracked a lot of people over a period of 18 weeks, and they saw, okay, in this, what kind of brands do people buy, and what are the sort of proportions of brands that they buy in these three different categories over a period of these 18 weeks. So they looked at bread, crisps, and bathroom tissue. And what they saw was basically when consumers buy something in the first week of when they're in this new situation, then they tend to a much higher degree, they tend to stick to those brands that they tried. And if that is, the experience was satisfactory with these brands, then people tend to stick to the first brands, or to much higher degree, they tend to stick to the first brands they tried, because in new situations that people are in, then there's a lot on, again, like in the current crisis, there's a lot of people on people's mind. As you can imagine, when you have a new kid or you move to a new city or whatnot, then you don't want to spend as much energy on sort of deciding what brands to buy and what products to use. So if you buy something and it was immediately, that product was satisfactory to you, then there's a much higher likelihood that you will stick to that product as long as you're in this new situation. And that then is relevant to the current situation, given that, how much people's life have changed. People are working from home, people then, etc. Then some people might have switched jobs, people might be working from home. And as a result, you find yourself in a lot different situation. I mean, you might have to buy different kinds of electronics to keep working from home. You might have need for more transportation or less transportation or different kinds of transportation. So you might have to try some different modes of transportation. You might have to buy groceries. You might have to switch your eating behavior, buy your lunch at a grocery store instead of buying at a restaurant, for so on. So people form a lot of different habits when something like this happens. So I would like to just point to the opportunity that it might also, for some brands, if you try to get in there early and try to get consumers who live under new circumstances to try your brand early, then there is a result that there's a likelihood that they might stick to your brand for a long time and create contribute to your bottom line for quite some time. So even though there's a huge crisis, there are also, for some brands who might benefit from this situation. There's an opportunity here in the midst of all this darkness. And also, lastly, I also wanted to talk about some of the aspects that you see during these crises. And a lot of times, these kind of situations that lead to new regulations and the large structural changes. For example, there's been these demands that arising from this current crisis, that a lot of the government support that is available, that would be tied to conditions of more sustainable production methods, more sustainable behaviors from companies. So a lot of times when these large shifts happen, there are a lot of new regulations coming into place, a lot of new laws being enacted, and so on, and that typically has quite maybe even larger effect on consumers than these sort of cognitive processes and these more sort of behavior-like processes that we've seen, that I discussed earlier in this presentation. You might want to expect a lot of government action that might also affect businesses and might affect consumer behaviors to a large extent than these financial resources and so on that I've discussed earlier. So in summing up this, presentation, just to see like looking at these crisis literature, you see on average that consumers tend to buy less for all the reasons that I mentioned before. There's a focus on the essential goods and essential products. There is a lot of research saying that these kind of crises lead to increased e-commerce, but there are also new habits forming, and that could be an opportunity for a lot of companies that can perhaps gain a lot of new customers that can contribute to the bottom line for quite some time to come. And that was a brief overview of some of the consumer behavior literature during crisis. And thank you for listening. And I will be very happy to take some of your questions, either through the chat or if you want to just. I don't know how our moderators want to do it. I'm just going to stop sharing here for a second so you can.
Yes, thank you so much, Jonas. We got a few questions from the audience. One is, how permanent are the change behaviors that COVID has caused or accelerated? What are the long-term effects as you see them?
I think a lot of the changes that I mentioned earlier, a lot of that is I mean, some like the changes into e-commerce and so on, a lot of that, like I said in the Hong Kong example, a lot of that is going to be there's going to be, as catalyst, a lot of that's going to be, it's not going to be a reverse, so to speak, but a lot of these behaviors that we see, like some of these sort of restraint that you see in purchasing and so on, that's going to probably bounce back within a couple of years. But then there's the possibility of sort of, like I said, with structural changes and things the macro trends and macro changes that are going on. So there might also be those aspects that sort of affect things long term. But in general, I think the most lasting change we're going to see is this change into more e-commerce.
Was there anything when conducting this research, was there anything you found surprising?
Yeah, I mean, this whole, like I mentioned, the outlier, two things that were sort of, that were surprising. First of all was this level of compulsive buying, this extreme stress that some people felt, that even though they had nothing, people still bought stuff, even though they really shouldn't. That was a surprising and actually somewhat sad finding. And the other interesting or really interesting aspect of it was this whole quest for simpler designs and simpler products and so on that tend to rise afterwards. This sort of preference that we seem to have after stressful events to go for more simpler products. That was quite interesting.
I can imagine. Thank you so much, Jonas, for this very interesting and highly relevant webinar on this topic. I think I learned a lot. I found it very, very interesting, and I really enjoyed listening to you. And also, thank you to all you for attending. We hope that you also found it enlightening, and please keep an eye out for the survey that we will send out and give us your feedback. We very, very much appreciate it. I also want to take this opportunity to pitch our next upcoming event, which takes place on November 19th, called How the Creative Industry Adapts to the COVID-19 Crisis. So November 19th at 5 CET. So us, SSE, in collaboration with the German SSE Alumni Hub, will invite you to a dynamic panel discussion that will reflect on both the ongoing impact and future solutions for the creative industry, as well as how cultural consumption, experience offerings, and participation patterns are changing during and after the crisis. I hope to see many of you there. And again, thank you so much, Jonas, for taking your time to educate us on this topic, and have a lovely evening.